Jack, we are back. Talking to my dear friend across the pond about the NBA draft. Jack, same day, 7 seconds later. How you feeling?
I'm embarrassed. I'm wearing the same thing for two
Yeah,
podcasts. This is a terrible look. It looks like I haven't washed or shaved or
yeah,
anything, but I'm good. I feel like we spoke about three fun guys yesterday. For the people that are listening in chronological
yes,
order,
yes.
we're about to speak about three really, really fun guys and three people that I think could really appeal to the Raptors for varying different reasons.
So before we get into the players, there's actually something I want to ask you because the questions you ask me in the DMs or when we talk
Yeah.
via podcast, a lot of times you take macro, like you take the macro approach. You step back and you look at things from a larger point of view. What do you make, and big shout out my friend Nabil for this, of the 31st pick in the draft, given second round salary structure implications, how important it is to hit on a second rounder now, the rising, value of that. Like, do you think this is a shifting landscape at all?
That's a good question. It's one that I was not prepared for, but I'm right. We're going to get to this. We're going to get through
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
The joke is that the early second rounder is now more valuable than the late first. I think sometimes you see guys can actually force their way to where they want in the second round. Personally, I think for the Toronto Raptors, the 31st pick is not necessarily as valuable as it would be to the Boston Celtics, to the Denver Nuggets, to I'd say the
sure.
Phoenix Suns, but they blast all of their picks into the solar system. They don't have a care in the world. I think that they've got swaps on their second round picks, let alone their first round picks. But I don't think that over the next few years, second round pick is going to come with the same sort of stigma that it perhaps has over the last decade. We're continuing to see as sort of the profile of players change that arrive in the NBA year on year, we're continuing to see second round picks hit more and more. These finds are more and more plentiful, but I think once you get into this range, it's even more about sort of fit and finding the right home and having a role sort of specified. And the three guys that we're going to talk about are three guys that I think could probably come in and contribute in their first season. And I think that's tended to be what we've seen with second round picks for whatever reason. It's like you take your flyers in the late first, you tie them up to this 4 year contract, and then the second round comes and it's like back to business. Who can we have in that will shoot 40% from three on volume and defend at their position? Who will we have come in that can be a reliable big man, etc.? But yeah, they're interesting. They are evolving.
It's a very interesting aspect of the draft, and now a very interesting aspect of salary cap implications. The one we want to talk about first, Dillon Jones, fourth year junior, also caught up in, as we all were, the COVID era
Yeah.
from Weber State, Dame Lillard's alma mater. 21 points per game, 10 boards, 5 assists, 49% from the field, 32% from three, 86% from the line, a modest 3-point rate, a high free throw rate. Dillon Jones, what's the pitch? What's the sell?
So I've been asking around about Dillon Jones to a couple of guys that I've had on my pod and just sort of putting the question out into, various Twitter group chats. And the perception seems to be a little bit all over the place. Some people absolutely love the production. You've just sort of started us off with the stats there, but this was the only player in college to have a 30% assist rate and a 30% rebound rate as well. It's just a fun profile of player to talk about, man.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose my sell would be 4 years in college, productive for all four of those years, real nose for the ball. And despite like that sky high rebounding rate, he's a ground bound player. He actually weighed in at 235 pounds at the combine, has a massive plus wingspan as well. But I've been really impressed with I'm going to come back to 2K. He's like one of the sort of like you're messing around with the My Player Builder. You might stumble upon Dillon Jones and go, hey, this is actually oddly effective. It's one of the sort of profiles that I make. And I have been shopping him out there as like, we've seen Josh Hart's value in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that value of having someone that, can grab boards, can grab offensive boards, can play make, not necessarily on high usage, but like has a high motor as well. I think that Dillon Jones is a different build of player, but I wonder if he can potentially bring similar skills to where you're stuffing your team with extra skills. You're not just settling for 3-and-D role player. Your role player can also handle the ball on the second side, can also go in for offensive rebounds, space, elite at the free throw line. I'm looking forward to talking about him.
That's very up my alley because this is year 6 that I've been advocating for Josh Hart as a Raptor. It was not feasible at all, and then it became feasible, became perhaps possible, and now
Yeah.
it's no longer possible at all. That guy might retire in New York the way that they love him, the way that he plays, and he's just the best. He's smaller than Tyrese Halliburton. He's shorter, and yet he'll go grab you 18 rebounds in a game. We talked about him a little bit on the podcast Caitlin and I did shortly before this one. You and I are doing. How does he collect 21 points in a game?
Mainly through, it's not for people that also listen to yesterday's podcast. We spoke about Bub Carrington traditionally being a above the break pick and roll player, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Dillon Jones primarily operates out of the pick and roll for Weber State, but he is also comfortable operating out of second side actions, having advantages created on the other side and then going and attacking a closeout. I think that he's really leveraged his weight and he's leveraged his really soft touch around the rim to create really good rim looks despite being a ground bound player. I think I checked before this podcast. I don't know if Dillon Jones actually had a dunk this year, but if you see some of like the angles at which he's finishing, he's facing away from the glass, throwing it almost above his head, little sort of baby hook, and it's just going in, nothing but net. He looks to me like a really high feel player that has made the most of not your typical NBA body.
Do you have any apprehension about a ground bound big boy?
As a ground bound big boy myself, I think I quite like it. I'll be honest, but in today's NBA, there's apprehension, and I think there's probably the need for creativity. And there is an argument that if you're selecting someone 31, how much of your creativity are you going to devote to sort of optimizing that guy? But then the other argument is, why not just sort of select good basketball players? Forget sort of the frame. But when you see 4 years of production, because he has been efficient, he has continued to work on his game year after year. He's got better from the free throw line. He's upped his 3-point attempt rate, which is a little bit low. But this is a guy that really, really cares. And this is a guy that knows how to maximize himself at the moment. And he's actually someone that I think would actually fit in a Darko system.
So I was about to say, a ground-bound big boy sounds very interesting for the Raptors in that they love their bigger guards and wings and forwards. Whoever fits there, you will be involved in just a shit ton of screening actions. Some to open guys up, some to create seals for you to create back cuts to receive passes from the post hub. Scotty and Pascal, before Pascal was traded, they were really, really good at the forward screen, and teams really had a boatload of trouble. How the Raptors attack out of the pick and roll is kind of traditional sometimes in that they won't space 5 out. They won't space to the dunker spot. They'll space Jakob Poeltl to the nail so that he becomes an outlet because teams are popping out on quickly, or if they're switching, Scotty will immediately seal the second man in the action. They automatic to Jakob, and Scotty has a seal directly back cut for the rim. So a big boy, there's room in a high feel offense that needs quick decisions, attack closeouts correctly. You'll be in, like Pascal went from being a guy who hardly ever screened under Nick Nurse to a guy who was screening a ton, just as an easy example of guys who you're going to be screening in Toronto. There's room. Do you believe in the jump shot at all to reward some of the motion and passing?
I think I believe in the spot up jump shot. I don't think that this is going to be a guy that's sort of hitting off the dribble threes, or he's not necessarily, because he's had this overwhelming physical advantage in terms of his weight and his wingspan at the level that he's played at. He's played in Weber State. This is not one of the major conferences. He's not necessarily had to develop this in-between game where you necessarily see that pull-up jumper thrive. But I think my evaluation was the spot-up jumper will be good enough that he credits a closeout, which means that he can then get into his driving game. Yeah, I think there are sort of two types of role players in the league: the guys that are going to pull up as soon as they catch the ball, and the guys that need to be just good enough from three to open up the space to attack. Sort of the advantage that Scotty has created, the advantage that RJ Barrett has created, the advantage that Manuel quickly has created. So there are concerns, particularly for the volume, but I think that he's put the work in to improve from the free throw line. He's happy to take more threes. He's taken more threes this year than he had previously. So I think he's happy to develop.
So, what was he most often defending, do you think, on the other side of the floor?
Forwards. He was most often defending forwards and wings. He's actually, for his frame, surprisingly sort of quick at moving his feet. So he's happy to sort of stay with quicker guys. Now, I'm not saying if Tyrese Maxey gets him out on the perimeter, he's not going to cook him. Probably will. But there was sort of this happy medium where if he was defending against guys that was sort of a similar size or maybe a little bit taller, he was able to use his weight to slow them down a little bit. The concern came when he was defending guys that were much smaller, that were much quicker, or when he was defending guys that were much bigger that could potentially just shoot over the top. Because while the lack of vertical pop hasn't sort of damaged his rebounding chops, it means that he is not a presence around the rim in terms of providing you sort of second-hand rim protection. I don't know if he actually registered above 10 blocks this year. I think if you look at the stat sheet, it's 0.1 blocks per game, and that has been consistent throughout his 4 years at Weber State.
So let's get into some of the theory crafting here then. And then we'll talk about Jamal from Houston. But so if Dillon does all this stuff, this unique stuff, can guard wings, but has a lot of trouble with guards, has a lot of trouble with bigs, do you see it and can't offer that secondary rim protection really? Can't step out. What kind of odd position do you think that puts a defense in if teams start to be like, well, we'd like to put that young man in actions, you know?
Yeah, it's going to challenge him, definitely. I think the sort of role that I viewed for Dillon when I was watching the film is, can he continue to learn not just how to use his frame and size on the offensive end, which he's done to a really, really sort of successful degree over his college career, but can he start to levy that size to slow up bigger guys, to potentially guard your... It's hard because if you have a weaker defender, you don't necessarily want them guarding like a star post player or a star big man. But
Mm-hmm.
can he be someone that gets physical? I'm not necessarily suggesting that Dillon Jones is going to come in and play 30 minutes a night here, but can he come in, play up tempo, offer something different, and hold up on that end? So, yeah, there are going to be issues, but I think offensively, the fit is there. I think that someone is going to take him. He feels like a bit of a Grizzlies pick to me. Someone that I was speaking to the other day described him as like
The Grizzlies grab all the weird in-betweeners.
they brought up David Roddy. That's who they brought up. Like in terms of
Jake
the
LaRavia,
build. Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
even I guess X isn't necessarily that, but X is kind of in that way. They also were early on Jonte.
Mhm.
Jonte, who's now expelled from the league, but Jonte was one of those like interesting ground bound bigs who's doing a lot of the in between stuff.
Yeah,
They've gone in on a lot of like they even have what's his face Junior Ken Lofton Junior as
yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
they have a they love those guys. That might happen, yeah.
And it might happen for the Raptors. One thing that I haven't mentioned is he was phenomenal at diamond up cutters this year as a guy that potentially drives into a potential sort of post up, drives into a 10-footer, and then he plays with his head up all the time so he can see when a guy is cutting. I think that his court vision is really, really good. And again, sort of like we spoke about with Bob Carrington, plays with a real cadence to his play where he's not rushed. He knows that he's not necessarily going to be the guy to burn someone and get to the rim and throw it down, but that means that he's playing with his head up and he's not going to force anything. He's just going to do what he's good at. So he's a little favourite of mine. I think he'd be an interesting experiment for the Raptors because I think he would fit into a Darko system. But yeah, defensively there are some question marks.
So there's this idea of a true point guard out in the world that people talk about. And in my mind, when I hear true point guard, I do think about 13 points, 6 assists, bad shooting percentages on a scrappy team. Like that's that's what I think about. Jamal Shead, senior, out of Houston,
Yeah.
13 points per game, 3.7 boards, 6 assists, 41% from the field, 31% from three, 78% from the free throw line, modest 3-point rate, modest free throw rate, modest assist rate. What do you make of Jamal, the leader of Houston's offense in some sense?
He won Defensive Player of the Year in his conference, despite being in the same conference as Ryan Dunn, who is like by a lot of people's or in a lot of people's estimations, he is one of the best defenders they've ever scouted. Point blank. Point blank. I just love if we've spoken about guys that potentially have this moldable skill set in the first podcast. We're talking about a guy that does something to an elite level already, and I know that he's giving up a size advantage in that he's 6 foot, not a massive plus wingspan. But what I see with Jamal Shead is playing in this Houston system. Do you know much about the Houston defensive system?
I'm ready to learn.
It's the most aggressive defensive system in the country, by far. They don't actually like trap on the perimeter; they blitz on the perimeter a ton. And their coach Kelvin Sampson was asked about it during the season. It was like, "Oh my god, you guys trap so much," and he said, "No, we don't trap. We set a line of scrimmage." So essentially, their idea is you have your guy handling above the break pick and roll. The big man comes out to screen, and wherever his top foot is, that sets the line of scrimmage, at which point both the big man and the guard defender will spring out onto the perimeter player and they will force him backwards as far as humanly possible, giving up a 4-on-3 behind them. But it is incredibly ferocious and it's worked incredibly well for the last couple of years. Houston, one of the best college teams in the country. I love the idea of bringing in a guy that has had to be part of a really complex defensive system, a guy that is clearly intelligent on the court in terms of his proprioception, reading
Yeah,
the
there we
game,
go.
knowing not just where to be in terms of these really, really aggressive blitzes on ball handlers, but also coordinating how are we rotating on the back line as well. And I think maybe I'm just sort of a little bit scarred from the Raptors post All-Star break last year. I was looking around for like my third second round pick. And I was like, can I just bring in someone that is going to bring in elite communication, elite commitment, and an archetype that I think we might see get a little bit more valuable? Like, there's obviously been this Gilbert Arenas get real point guards back. There's been this Phoenix Suns discourse like they need a point guard, they need someone to pass Kevin Durant the ball. But what I've really taken away from this playoffs is having someone that can hound at an elite level, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, TJ McConnell, even like a Jaden McDaniels for your bigger players is really, really
One
valuable.
of
And
those
while like,
things is not like the other, I will
that's
say.
true. That's true. That's true. I had S on and I was like, I think that Jaden could be an all-star and we didn't get into it, but that's like another podcast on its own. But yeah, I just think that bringing in someone with an elite skill set that has been able to be part of one of the winningest teams during his sort of like college stint is a really interesting proposition and like a bet on maybe bringing in a real sort of character guy to a young locker room and sort of setting the tempo as the tempo or I suppose standards have been set in Houston.
So this is something I've really wondered about from the team building philosophy because Emmanuel quickly has disappointed me as an on-ball guy since coming over from New York. You wonder immediately because you're not winning a championship if you don't have a guy who gets on the ass of the elite guard on the other end. Emmanuel, in speaking to a lot of the Knicks people I respect most, the most exciting part of his defense was the off-ball stuff. And the off-ball stuff is interesting and good. It didn't get to be as good on the Raptors because the team is worse defensively. So that stuff doesn't pop as much. The on-ball stuff had a lot of trouble. So immediately you start thinking like, well, quickly he's like 25. It's not like he's going to suddenly become elite at the point of attack. How do you start to shore up the hole there?
Mhm.
If Jamal is the guy who can survive on offense in the NBA, there's something there, it seems. I want the pitch. How does he live on offense? How does he make that work?
I think it's the sheer injection of energy, particularly starting in his NBA career against second units. Sometimes I'm sure that you watch a lot of Pacers due to sort of like the bromance with Caitlin. Obviously, you've been watching them
Sure.
during this playoff stint as well. There are moments, even during the regular season, where TJ McConnell comes into a game and it's like I just wake up. Like, oh my God, TJ McConnell's in the game. Things are happening here. I think that Jamal on the offensive end is someone that could potentially perform the traditional point guard role of, can I get better scorers on my team, the looks that they want? Can I get them into the positions that they want to be in? And for a team that doesn't rely on a 50 pick and rolls per game at the top of the key Helio star, if you're running a ton of off ball action, and if this guy is just being trusted to make the right decision as opposed to sort of create his own gravity, can he be there setting the table while you're running your split cuts off the elbows, while Grady's coming off a pin down, while RJ Barrett is potentially screening for another guy and someone else is getting free? So I don't necessarily know how much he's going to score. He's a really determined driver because he's obviously giving up this size advantage, and he has been able to score at the college level. Obviously, he might get swept
Yeah.
up by sort of like these, the NBA big men that you only encounter in the NBA. But I think the trade off of having someone that can come in and genuinely change a game might be worth suffering sort of the offensive mishaps.
And the unique thing here is that like it is a second round pick. People probably when they hear a lot of what we're talking about, I think the first guy you think of is like Chris Dunn, maybe.
Right?
And you wonder like, ooh, how did that work out? But he's the fifth overall pick. Getting a guy like this in the second round and being like, well, we know you're going to do some things at the NBA level. We know you're able to input yourself. We know you've played successful basketball. We're going to trust in all this kind of stuff and whatever peripheral stuff they pay for / look at, all that good stuff. Who knows? But I like when teams bet on guys who have a history of like, yeah, I got on the court and I made it work. There,
Mm-hmm.
there are guys who sometimes it seems like the draft process can get a little bit far left of like, I saw him make this play 3 times during the
Yeah,
season,
yeah.
and I'm wondering if he can make it 38 times in 42 games. Like, it can get a little bit that way,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard to
Like
input
tip
your
boxy.
game. What's that?
Like tip boxy. It's like people
Yeah,
sort of scout prospects by just going, right, it's made a spot up three, it's made an off the dribble three, it's thrown
yeah,
down an alley oop. Great, this is Michael Jordan. Next.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Interestingly, Stephen No, who I think is a friend of the podcast,
Yeah.
wrote about Jamal Shead for Sporting News a couple of months ago, made the Pat Bev comp of just another
Mm-hmm.
guy who I think Pat Bev went undrafted. And I know that he's not necessarily the most popular name in NBA media at the moment, but he is someone that has consistently contributed to winning, despite if you were to look at him on the street and if you were to look at his sort of college production, you wouldn't necessarily see a winning player there. Sometimes these guys that can just bring the intensity, and more so with Sheed, I just think this unique environment that he's being brought up in defensively should really give you like an elite communicator as well as an
Sure.
elite on-ball defender.
Well, also, like, if you get Patrick Beverley's career out of a
Mhm.
second round pick, you've done the thing, especially earlier
Yeah,
on when he was actually more effective. And if you get Patrick Beverley's career out of a second round pick without all the, like, sorry, Pat, but like the jackassery that has accompanied Patrick Beverley his whole career,
yeah.
um, big win. These aren't sexy names, but these are names in the NBA and names you've heard and names that have been around. And if you get a second round pick who's around, well done to you. Uh,
Mhm.
Bobi Klintman, a
Bobby,
play.
just Bobby,
Oh, it's
Ricky Bobby
Bobby.
style.
Oh,
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
Bobi Klintman. Sorry, Bobby, if you end up listening to this regional Raptors podcast.
I'm
Bobi
sure he will.
Klintman. Oh, that's so funny because I would have heard his name pronounced correctly on the Raptors broadcast, but that was what I was going to say. This guy has
Mhm.
played against Pascal Siakam and
Right.
Scotty Barnes. He's played against Jakob Poeltl as a member of the Taipans, another team across the pond, out in Cairns or Canes.
Yeah.
I guess, are you mimicking the accent when you say it or are you pronouncing it correctly?
Cairns. Cairns.
Cairns. Yeah.
Cairns.
I
Bobi
never know how
Klintman.
to feel about that.
Yeah, I know. It's,
Regardless, he's 21 years old,
yeah.
9.7 points, 4.8 boards, zero point 0.7 assists,
Mhm.
44% from the field, 36% from three, 79% from the free throw line, and he's out in the NBL. And he had a 3 of 12 game against the Raptors once upon a time. It wasn't his best. What is the pitch on our boy Bobby?
3 of 12. He's trashed. Forget it. We'll just cut the podcast.
No boxes ticked.
Yeah. The pitch is that Bobi Klintman is the quintessential Raptors pick. He is
Sure.
6'8.5" without shoes. He has a 6'11" wingspan. He gets out in transition. He is a big that has shown shooting flashes, basically. He was close to declaring for the draft back in 2023. There were rumors that he had a promise. People were speculating that that promise was from Orlando because he's also an Orlando pick. You know, he's one of these guys that you get to this stage in the draft, and particularly a draft where you're looking around and you're going, there aren't necessarily like people that are going to set the world alight here. And it's, can we find someone that could potentially be a big wing that can shoot one day? That is my pitch. He's gone over to Australia. He's played pro ball this year. He's played 20 minutes per game. I was encouraged by his 3-point attempt rate as well as the percentages and the free throw line percentage as well. I just think that if you ask me today, who are the Raptors picking? Or if like for whatever strange reason, if sports betting gets this bad and it's like, and with the 31st pick, the odds-on favorite is Bobi Klintman, this guy would be the leader in the clubhouse right now.
Mm. So I had a really great conversation
Mhm.
last year with Steve Clifford about the NBL, Australian basketball. I think it's a really great hub for guys to go get reps in. It's physical, it's
Mhm.
hard nosed. And for guys who represent like that skill end of things, like Bobby is supposed to, I think, we're seeing these guys be put in kind of like the physical ringer that introduces them to the physicality that they're inevitably going to feel some of at the next level. I think the NBL is particularly good at that.
Yeah.
Um, how does Bobby fit into what the Raptors want to do?
Well, one of the other reasons I wanted to pick him is because I feel like for so long this team has been Team 6'9". It's had the abundance of wings and forwards where you almost look and go, how the hell can we get all
And
these
now they
guys
have
on the
none.
floor?
Just Scotty.
Now they have none. And quite frankly, I just don't want Scotty Barnes playing the wing stopper role. I want him playing the backline sweeper role.
Sure.
So Bobby would be my bet of, can you come in and long term be the guy that takes the tough defensive assignments on the wing? Can you be a guy that potentially does provide some sort of backline rim protection as well? Because again, I come back to this podcast that I did with Mike a couple of days ago. We spoke about how like, this is my tendency for the macro here. It was what's the future of the NBA? The idea of having guys with sort of overlapping skill sets. So if you give up a switch, if someone is out of position, you are not necessarily burnt in the way that you've been burnt in the 2010s. It's not necessarily Jamal Shead or TJ McConnell as your low man. It's
Mm-hmm.
another 6'8" guy that maybe isn't quite as good a backline defender as Scotty Barnes is, but you're not giving up too much there. So to me, he's just a bit of a Swiss Army knife, particularly on the defensive end.
Democratic rim protection. We talked about the
Yeah,
Grizzlies, their selections. Democratic rim protection is a term coined by Henry Ward, who used to be on this podcast all the time before the Grizzlies scooped him up. I've loved that term for a long time. He was a
it's
huge
good.
fan of what the Raptors used to do, what the Thunder currently do, and are doing very successfully to seal off the rim in the playoffs now. I do. I think sometimes the cart gets put ahead of the horse in theory
Mhm.
crafting. That's like S did this big video where he talked to everybody about how Wembanyama will change the NBA if that means that like point guards go out of style. And you just watch wings and forwards, they just can't run offense the same way as guards. And
Yep.
they just don't access some things as easily that it's like, no, nobody's going out of style. It's just things are changing on the margins. And one of the things changing on the margins is backline defense, secondary rim protection. And Bobby, I can't say I saw a ton of it in the like 134-91 game that the Raptors played against them in the preseason, but
Yeah.
I'll have to dig into more film to see like what the sell is really. But it's important. I don't know. People have played basketball. It's not exactly the same, but how did you feel when you took a step into the lane and the guy helping was like 5'4" versus a guy being like 6'2"? You feel it.
Yeah.
It's a difference.
Yeah.
There's an effect there. And you watch enough basketball, you see how bigger players affect players driving to the rim. That it's just it happens. So it's a you can improve your defense just by getting bigger. We've seen
Mhm.
countless teams do this. The best defenses in history, except for Golden State, were huge. Being big and shrinking the floor rocks. You just have to be able to survive on the other end of the floor on offense. And Darko seems to be building a system where he's able to get a lot out of players offensively, like a lot, a
Right.
lot. He's done a really great job on that end. He needs a little bit more talent on the defensive end to help him get more out of that end. Perhaps that's the sell with Bobby.
Yeah. To your point, like as a baseline, a willing cutter, someone that has shot 36% from three this year on about 4 attempts per 36. Someone that people were excited about last year for his potential off the dribble shot creation. I haven't necessarily seen that. I think he's going to profile as much more of a play finisher, particularly for the start of his NBA career, because he will get drafted this year. It will happen, probably to the Raptors. We'll see. Uh, but I think it's a good start if you have a willing cutter, someone that understands when to go, and someone that can potentially space, particularly from the corners, very successful from the corners as well, but also those not above the break threes, but sort of like your lifts, your
Yeah.
lifts, I suppose. Yeah,
They got a million different names for it. You can call it
that's the
shake,
thing.
you can call
So
lift, you
many.
can form up, whatever people want to say. It's yeah, shake, shape, lift, form. There's always a million things in basketball. That was
Mhm.
like I won't say it here, but like a get action. The Raptors call that something different in house, and it's like, damn, everybody in the world calls it a get, but you don't call it a get. Like
Yeah.
basketball jargon is very jargon-y. Jack, we'll certainly have you back on. If you reach out to me and want to talk about more guys, happy to. But definitively, if like you said, if he gets drafted, if we hit on anything, a deep dive will be needed for whoever the Raptors select, especially if we've seen that you have predictive powers. Is there anything you want to say to people before we take a hiatus from Samson and Jack before you inevitably end up getting one of these picks correct?
Yeah, I'm just going to say 100 guys. No, I want to say I want to say RIP to our Reed Sheppard podcast that was in the
Yeah.
works. If the pick did not convey, Reed measured at a 42.5-inch vertical during the combine. So I said to Samson in the DMs, we literally could have led with Steph Curry with a 40-inch vertical, like the best YouTube title of all time. Um, but yeah, I'm doing a ton of work actually on the podcast at the moment. I'm writing a bit more. I just wrote about the Atlanta Hawks and the ramifications of keeping that pick, what that means they could do going forward now. A lot of my work is going to be on FFSN. I'm going to have a ton of guests on through the pre-draft process, through the remainder of the playoffs as well. So check out the drop step if you haven't already. I will certainly have Samson on at some point, so you will get some good Raptors content at some point from the drop step podcast.
And if you haven't picked it up already, it would surprise me if you haven't, but Jack is a podcast superstar. Hopefully you go over there and enjoy some more. Also, to the Reed Shepherd point, I thought it was very apt. because he kind of has like a bowl cut, right?
Yeah.
And somebody was like, if this guy gotta give this guy a good barber and watch what happens. Like,
Yeah.
if they give him the Dante DiVincenzo fade, people would be like, this guy could go number one in the draft. You know what I mean? But like,
100%.
kind of the hokey, like bowl cut, unassuming look. Because he's a handsome guy, shredded, obviously jumps out of the gym, shoots the ball well. He forms, shapes, lifts, shakes, all the things you need. Believe that for people who have, lottery picks to talk about. But yeah, I thought that was so funny. A good haircut it'll change the world for some people. Go ahead.
Son of a Kentucky legend as well. Like the mystique was just there. It's like he's got it in his genes. He's going to be,
Hmm.
the next great white hope of the NBA as long as you give him a skin fade. But no, that's not happened. So for the moment, he will be one of those real hoopers know about Reed Sheppard guys.
Right. Real hoopers know. All right. Jack, thank you so much for coming on, dedicating about an hour 20 of your life to the draft hopes, the draft hopefuls of the Toronto Raptors. We thank you very much. And listeners, please go listen to the Drop Step NBA podcast because Jack is the best. And he also is constantly having my pals on. I love a guy who talks to my pals. We've got a network of pals talking about hoops. That's what I would name like a basketball podcast network. Pals talking about hoops. That's what I
I
think it would
like
be.
that. I
Yeah.
think we're on to something here.
Yeah.
Let's stay on the line.
Yeah. Yeah. Watch this space.
Yeah.
All right, Jack. All right, listeners, whether you got into this in the morning or at night, have a blessed day and goodbye.